put a spell on you. Because you're mine.
Fledgling by Octavia E. Butler is a 2005 vampire novel based in the area around Seattle, Washington. As Stephenie Meyer's Twilight is also a 2005 novel based in the area, this makes for an interesting comparison. Overall, Fledgling is much better than Twilight, and can be considered the book that deserved to go viral instead. It uses the standard vampire power fantasy in an empathetic way that makes the characters feel much more human than in similar vampire stories. And it uses the trope in which vampires are a metaphor for race politics in a way much more overt and compelling than things like Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter and True Blood / Southern Vampire Mysteries. It very carefully and intelligently depicts a mentally adult woman in the body of a prepubescent girl, similar to the depictions of Claudia in Interview with the Vampire and Mina in Dance in the Vampire Bund, while neither shying away from the character's sexuality nor depicting it in a skeevy manner. It's also the first book I've read that seems perfect for adaptation into a video game, as its vampire power fantasy reminds me of that shared by role-playing games. In general, Fledgling escapes the problematic storytelling that has made Butler's past works distasteful for me. In contrast to the homophobic element in Dawn, Fledgling has an active appreciation of bisexuality, and the protagonist is a polyamorous bisexual woman participating in many happy romances. However, there is a very significant problem in the depiction of the standard vampire domination fantasy, in which vampires use coercion to acquire harems of human mates, as entirely ethical, ignoring the very real similarities to slavery it presents, which recreates Dawn's problems in the depiction of sexual coercion. The story begins with the violent rebirth of our protagonist, who we will eventually learn to be called Shori. Shori is a badly injured vampire with amnesia, relying solely on her instincts as she fulfills her basic needs, like finding food and healing. She unknowingly devours a human alive, and hunts several deer throughout the woods. Unlike the standard vampires in fiction, she eats meat when she's especially hurt, and this allows her to heal super fast. She can also survive in full sunlight, though she is weakened by it and prefers the darkness. As we will learn, her resistance to sunlight is a trait unique to black vampires like Shori, and isn't a universal vampire thing in the Fledgling universe. She starts exploring the world with scientific curiosity, trying to piece together the clues presented to her. This is probably the best part of the book. It taps into the heart of science fiction. She's an alien being, using her reasoning skills to build a mental model of how the world works. She's very humanoid, which allows us to empathize with her, but there's just enough difference to make it intriguing. She finds a collection of houses burned to the ground, and she correctly presumes that she came from there and sustained injuries from the fire. There are human remains around, but she doesn't remember the people. She ends up by the highway, and a white man named Wright sees her and tries to help. Wright thinks that she's a young girl and brings her into his car to take care of her. He wants to drive her to the hospital, but she fights him and ends up biting him. She instinctively drinks his blood but doesn't kill him. Like in Twilight, fledgling vampires have venom. While Twilight uses venom for vampires to make quick kills and turn humans into vampires, Fledgling has it fulfill the part of the glamour, and the power to turn humans into vampire-serving thralls. The word thrall is a Scandinavian word, originally referring to the lower caste of the feudalistic system of Viking society, people kept as property to be bought and sold, who served those higher up in the hierarchy. They are distinguished from English slaves in very small technical ways. If you're not an anthropologist or historian, it's reasonable to say that the words thrall and slave are synonymous. The idea of magic spells being used to enslave someone, or enthrall them, goes way back, and it became one of Count Dracula's powers. Probably because Bram Stoker wanted to dance around the idea of seduction more than Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. I'm not sure which work was the first to do it, but somewhere along the line it became popular to refer to victims of vampire enchantment as thralls, probably because slave is considered too mundane a term for something so extraordinary. It's a very common trope in vampire fiction for vampires to take human thralls, devoted servants treated as non-persons by the superior vampire class. Fledgling plays with this trope, handles it more empathetically than most depictions, but it still ultimately works with the same trope of vampires having enthralling powers and binding humans to them, forever. Shori biting Wright has the following effects. 1. Making him addicted to her venom. 2. Inducing sexual pleasure. 3. Making him extremely sexually aroused by her. 4. Making him extremely open to suggestion. And 5. Significantly extending his lifespan. Yeah, I'm not seeing a subversion. It's a standard vampire domination fantasy. It's a recipe for a human pet, a sex slave, a vampire thrall, same as in any number of vampire works. Here, Shori acts from a state of ignorance, so she can't be blamed for enthralling him, but she never regrets it either, even after she finds out what her bite does. She might as well say, "Right is mine," like Vampire Bill says,
"Suki is mine,"
in True Blood. It's effectively the same vampire BDSM fantasy, except True Blood and the Southern Vampire Mysteries are from the submissive's point of view, and Fledgling is from the dominant's point of view. Shori doesn't quite understand what's going on, but she understands that she has imposed her dominance, and she gets Wright to take her back to his place. She then remembers that she repays her human companions by having sex with them, which is rather similar to Lucifer paying a psychologist with sexual favors, in the rather over-the-top BDSM fantasy that is Lucifer. It is notable that this is spun as an expression of dominance, as that's something usually only afforded to men. As part of the vampire domination fantasy, Shori acquires enough power that she is effectively on the same level as Lucifer, as he acts as a man paying sexual favors. At first, Wright is reluctant, because Shori looks like a young girl, but Shori knows that she's much older than she looks, and she gets him into bed with minimal prodding. It's important to note that Wright is not a pedophile like Hawken and Let the Right One In. His arousal is induced by Shori's venom, and she is in complete control. On the one hand, this is good because it allows the child-bodied vampire to for once have a decent love life, and we know that Wright isn't exploiting her. What about the opposite, though? We have good evidence that Wright would never consent to sex with her if she didn't drug him, so she is essentially a rapist with a roofie in her bite. However, like with Dawn, there is no recognition of the fact that women can rape men. I think there is room for sexual fantasies that depict scenarios that would be unethical to literally enact, as long as there's a conscious recognition of their unethical nature. If Planet Earth and Gore didn't try to make super meaningful political statements about feminism being evil, I'd probably be fine with their depictions of women owning men and men owning women for the purpose of sexual fantasy. There should be room for slavery fantasies and rape fantasies in the proper context. The problem comes when stuff like Fledgling and Dawn pretend that their slavery and rape fantasies aren't that, and that they instead depict an ethical world. As a result, they become extremely problematic. Shori spends some time lying low and researching on the internet. She feeds off of Wright, but needs more than what he can offer, so she goes hunting. This part is an overt power fantasy. The world is her oyster. She can enter any building, take whatever she wants, bite whomever she wants, and gain control over them, to own them. It's a bloody domination fantasy. Pun intended. She selects a lonely, elderly white woman named Theodora. She bites her from behind and orders her not to turn around. She repeatedly feeds off of her this way, and Theodora starts to eagerly anticipate her visits. It's kind of like Carmilla from the vampire's perspective, except that LaFanu was honest about Carmilla being a fang rapist. Shori finally lets Theodora see her, and Theodora is startled that Shori doesn't look at all like Dracula or Lestat, as she envisioned her vampire visitor to look like. In addition to naming other important attributes, she explicitly says that she expected a white person. I imagine the author encountered many white people who acted like this, and Theodora's age might account for her bluntness, but this says to me that Theodora is racist. It makes me dislike her, and I don't see why Shori still wants a relationship. But she does, and we get a fairly decent depiction of bisexual polyamory. Shori maintains an active relationship with both of her humans. The bisexual nature is depicted smoothly. As sort of an alien being, Shori can avoid the homophobia that would come up with a human character. She just wants Theodora, and then acquires her. Theodora deals with internalized homophobia, but she can't deny that she is attracted to Shori, and she accepts it as readily as the vampire part. At the same time, however, it's again a slavery and rape fantasy, not acknowledged as such. Shori ends up biting a guy who was also bitten and enthralled by another vampire, and she and Wright track them down. The vampire, a white man named Yosef, is Shori's father. Upon learning of her amnesia, he provides exposition in a rather awkward info dump. It's not nearly as bad as Lord Foul's Bane, but I've seen far better exposition deliveries, such as that in the vampire novel Ever After. Vampires are called Ina, They're a superhuman humanoid species from Eastern Europe.
Just because she's
an undead fiend from the pits of hell?
I'm from Eastern Europe. Potato, potato.
They don't know their exact origins and have competing mythologies with similar themes, the most common of which involves a mother goddess, which is a piece of world building I love. Not only do Ina have different religions from humanity, they have different religions among each other. Ina are matriarchal, which is interesting, but we don't actually get to see it. Shori is extremely disadvantaged because of her relatively young age of 55 and her amnesia, so we mostly never see her regarded as of higher status than male Ina. Ina don't massacre humans, they keep harems of human symbiotes. Companions whose blood they can feed off for decades, if not centuries. They don't consider it slavery, even though it involves drugging people against their will and acquiring consent under duress, and essentially marking them as the property of specific Ina. It's considered one of the more perfect forms of love. Shori's actions are then retroactively endorsed. Ina aren't undead, just durable and long-living. Sunlight does kill them though, a weakness that is partially attributable to their pale skin. Until very recently, Ina have been all white. They started using science to interbreed with black humans, whose dark skin gives them a sort of superpower of resistance to sunlight. Because of their dark skin, Shori and her siblings are the superior forms of creatures that can be considered as a sort of white supremacist fantasy symbol, in that they're superhuman and very pale. In fact, this is a criticism frequently leveled at Twilight. It is a very striking anti-racist statement. Shori's mother and sisters were killed in the fire, but she still has a little brother named Stefan, who Yosef introduces. Unfortunately, Ina don't like hanging out with Ina of the opposite sex, so Shori can't stay with her family. She goes back with Wright. After a few days, Wright tries to phone Yosef to no avail. They drive out to investigate and find Yosef's place burned to the ground. Yosef and Stefan are dead, and Shori is now without any close blood relatives. There are, however, surviving human symbiotes, Brooke and Celia, who are physically addicted to venom and must be bound to Ina to live. The vampire equivalent of Vulcan's have sex or die pon farr, and Shori accepts them as an inheritance, essentially treating them like property. Because of the fact that they were chemically bound to Yosef and Stefan, they're a little resistant to becoming Shori symbiotes, but the book emphasizes that this is only chemically and not intellectually, so it's kind of like them agreeing to an arranged marriage that they don't really want but can see the value in. It's not the most ethical or consensual thing in the world, but the book completely ignores the problems with it in order to focus on this domestic drama where they learn to get along in Shori's growing group marriage. The four of them go to Brooke and Celia's place, but the arsonists, a bunch of gun-toting humans, attack there next. Shori fights back, but they succeed in lighting the place on fire, and she leads her group in a retreat. Brooke can vaguely remember the way to a complex belonging to another Ina family, the Gordons, and they go there. Shori learns that she had an attraction to the eldest Gordon son, Daniel Gordon, so this gives her the opportunity to romance yet another character and acquire an Ina mate, which is for all intents and purposes a bit higher on the hierarchy than her relationships with humans, even though the book insists that it's non-hierarchical. She makes contact with Daniel and secures entry into the complex. They call a meeting and discuss the attacks.
Man, I specialize in hunting black vampires. I don't know what the PC name for that is.
Wright puts forward 3 explanations for the attackers. 1. They're humans playing Van Helsing and trying to defeat evil vampires. 2. They're agents of Ina envious of Shori's family's superpowers. Or 3. They're agents of racist Ina who don't like the existence of black Ina, especially black Ina who are more powerful than white Ina. The Gordons have a hard time accepting that unethical Ina exist, and they naively insist that Ina don't make humans kill for them, and that Ina don't buy into human prejudices. Of course, number 3 will turn out to be the correct one, making the arsonists essentially a lynch mob. They'll have to deal with them eventually. Until then, Shori's people settle in at the Gordon place and socialize. They get to know the Gordons and their symbionts, and they get to know each other. Shori also snoops on her symbionts talking about her when they don't know she's there, and it's revealed that typically Ina takes symbionts in a more ethical way than Shori did with Wright and Theodora, where they bite them only to establish the compulsion to keep Ina secret, and then introduce the idea of them becoming symbionts and let them choose. Typically, it takes several bites before the venom induces addiction so strong that withdrawal symptoms would kill them, so they have an opportunity to quit. As a female Ina, Shori has stronger venom, and she wasn't aware of this protocol when acquiring Wright and Theodora, so she took them with greater force. The ethical concerns are played down because Shori had amnesia, but I find it questionable to say the least. She essentially roofied people into becoming lifelong devotees, and everybody's just okay with this. Wright emphasizes that Shori is ethical when she has an understanding of what's going on, and the book just goes with that. Even though he's the least objective source on the matter, being arguably irrationally loyal to Shori. And Shori doesn't really seem that ethical outside of an assumed fictional context in which vampires are treated as superior and humans are treated as slaves, which the book insists isn't going on. There's a part later on where she talks to one of the Gordon symbionts, Martin, a black guy who says he first thought it sounded like slavery instead of symbiosis, and it has the implication that he only thought of slavery because he's black and had it as a cultural fear, instead of it being an accurate read on the situation. Even without Shori's deviations from Ina protocol, it resembles slavery. It happens to be the kind of slavery where you get to choose entry, so it's less like American slavery and more like Chinese slavery. But it's still within the realm of slavery humans are known to practice. You're signing up to be a vampire's submissive partner, and once you're in it, you can't get out, thanks to the venom addiction plot device. Just because you can find happiness in slavery doesn't make it not slavery. And it's not like those initial bites to establish dominance are consensual. It's a lot like dealing with dragons' depiction of Princess Cimarine choosing to be owned by the dragon Gazul to keep dragons from eating her, and treating this as like an empowering job where she can have exciting feminist adventures, despite apparently being slavery. But at least that lets her choose to stay when presented with opportunities to leave. Fledgling just forces in the venom addiction plot device to keep Shori in a state of relative dominance, which is fine if you admit it's all BDSM fantasy, but the book just doesn't. Getting back to the Pacific Northwestern vampire mystery, the arsonists attack the Gordon's complex in the daytime. Shori uses her superior Black Ina abilities to organize the symbionts and fight them off before they can set off any fires. They take 3 attackers alive, and she and the Gordons interrogate them. Their minds have been addled by Ina venom, so they don't remember much, but it's apparent that the attackers were innocent humans grabbed off the street and brainwashed by racist Ina to kill the Black Ina, who they feel are corrupting the Ina bloodline with human DNA, especially black human DNA. The attackers are indicated to be victims of the racist Ina as much as their targets were. The Gordons figure out that the racist Ina would have to be the Silk family, so they hold a formal trial, a council of judgment. Lots of different Ina families pour in with all of their symbiotes, and there's a big legal drama going on according to Ina laws. It reminds me a fair bit of Breaking Dawn, with the same flaw of having so many characters that it's hard to keep everyone straight. Breaking Dawn's publishers chose to put in a character index in the back, and I wish Fledgling did as well. Shori has Theodora brought to the Gordon's complex in the middle of all this. Theodora is a very lonely woman whose family essentially abandoned her, so getting to be a part of this thriving community of symbionts and Ina is a bit of a dream come true to her. Shori leaves her with some symbionts to settle in. The legal drama itself is similar to a lot of real-world trials with racism as the motivation for the attacker, but it's in the Ina world, with Ina legal protocols and different racial histories. Though the other Ina are white, they don't have the history of regarding themselves as white and being the descendants of slave owners, as would dominate any human trial. The Silks and their allies choose to associate themselves with human whiteness, if not humanity, but the concept is generally alien to the rest of the Ina, which allows for a bit of freedom away from human racial nonsense. Instead of focusing on a racial angle, the Silks and their legal advocate, Kathleen Dolman, try to paint Shori as crazy, having become irrational from grief and not a valid witness. Shori rebukes this by asserting that her amnesia means that she doesn't really know any of the people killed, so she doesn't actually have grief. Kathleen tries to rectify this by killing someone Shori does know. She has her symbiont murder Theodora, so that Shori will actually become visibly grieving and could supposedly be irrational. This makes Theodora basically a woman in the refrigerator, but I don't think that has the usual negative value. The original woman in refrigerator was a love interest that the writers couldn't figure out what to do with, so they had a male villain kill her off screen and let the male hero find her body in the fridge to motivate him to take his revenge on the villain. The objection comes from sacrificing a female character for male pain. In this case, Shori covers the book with feminine prominence, and even the villain responsible is female, so it's not the same problem. Shori pushes through her pain to see to it that Kathleen and the Silks are punished for their crimes. Kathleen loses her cool and attacks Shori outright, which is a major Ina no-no, and she is executed. The Silks are punished, and the Silk family line is disbanded to keep their elitism from continuing. Ina racism will most likely continue to be an issue, but steps are taken against it. Shori is adopted by an Ina family, and she will relearn her identity and live with her symbionts in peace. The end. Fledgling is a good vampire story. I don't want my criticisms to overshadow the fact that I did enjoy this story. I'm actually disappointed that the book is standalone. I want a whole Ina series. I'm not very well versed in black feminism, so I don't really know how to judge Shori as a female character, but I liked getting in her head and enjoying the vampire power fantasy. Given that the whole book is basically about empowering Shori, giving the reader a power fantasy, I tentatively approve, but if some black feminist wants to argue with me about it, I'm not going to defend that point. I do think that the general female presence is good, and that Shori's overall power makes Theodora's fridge stuffing not have the usual negative value. A lot of vampire works deal with the issue of racism, usually through portraying the vampires as a minority race themselves, like True Blood, while Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter portrays vampires as white races to be defeated by white ally vampire hunters. Fledgling goes for what might be a healthier angle by reproducing the same racial conflict among vampires, and having the characters deal with the same racism we're used to in a different context. The black protagonist has to deal with the same old in a different form than we expect, and she can defeat this evil in its new context according to new rules. Racism is also present in its old form, with Theodora being disappointed that Shori isn't a tall white man like Dracula or Lestat, which I think makes her totally undesirable as a partner, but Shori continues to pursue her, and Theodora comes around to being the symbiont of a small black girl, so there's a victory for racial equality there. The Ina function as a commentary on the depiction of vampires as a white symbol. While doing online research at Wright's Place, Shori comments that she can't find reference to black vampires. Theodora underlines this sentiment by supposing, by virtue of being a vampire, Shori would be a tall white man. Vampires have traditionally been used to represent a romantic ideal, and our racist white society tends to put a white man in that role. As the character is undead, they tend to be pale, and this paleness is emphasized more than any other deathly trait, emphasizing the whiteness of the vampire archetype. In the case of Twilight, the paleness goes hand in hand with the vampire's unearthly beauty, and it as a result promotes white supremacy. Fledgling takes the idea of vampires as this symbol of white power, and portrays them instead as fundamentally weak because of their whiteness. Their salvation of a species is in the transition to blackness. The concept of black people doing better in sunlight because of their dark skin is used with the concept of vampires burning in the sun to give half-Ina, half-black human hybrids a special ability as plausible as anything else vampire-related. The racist dystopian novel Save the Pearls uses that same symbolic advantage as a means to demonize black people, but Fledgling uses it for a positive depiction. As a black half-Ina, half-human, Shori is a powerful figure for goodness, similar to Blade. Yeah, Blade exists. This whole symbol subversion is somewhat mitigated by the fact that Fledgling's assertion that there are no black vampires is erroneous. Dracula had a blaxploitation makeover as Blackula in 1972.
Yes, I only hunt Blackulas.
Eddie Murphy was the vampire in Brooklyn in 1995. Aaliyah was the Queen of the Damned in 2002. Of course, Wesley Snipes was Blade in 1998, and there are various black vampire characters sprinkled throughout general vampire works. Vampires don't have to be pale to be undead, they can be steel gray. Or, they could forget about deathly traits altogether. I'm willing to forgive this oversight, though, because the vampire archetype does have value in Western culture as this pale symbol of white power, with the black vampires as exceptions to the rule, sometimes overtly noted as with the title Blackula. And I think it's reasonable to hand-wave away these examples of black vampires to make the point that Fledgling makes. Symbolically, the use of race in Fledgling is very powerful. Having Shori as the biracial half-human, half-vampire, appreciating her black human side, and recognizing her white father as someone she could love, is powerful. It's a pity that there aren't more adventures of Shori dealing with race politics in the Ina world, and I hope the Butler estate will release rights to it sometime in the future, so that someone else could continue it, as may happen with the potential Dawn TV series. One way that Fledgling has the potential to expand to other media is through a video game adaptation. It's not often that I think a book would make a good video game, but I think Fledgling taps into the same sort of power fantasy and storytelling as a lot of role-playing games. The protagonist's amnesia, her discovery of the world, her interactions with other characters, and the rather linear plot would lend itself well to an RPG. The first level would have her wander through the woods, hunt deer to get the player used to the controls, and discover the ruins where she'd scavenge items and learn a bit of the plot. Wright would find her and take her back to his place for level 2, where she would wander around town, going right into people's houses, taking their stuff, and romancing them, as is the RPG fantasy. She wouldn't have to get Theodora as her next symbiont. She could have her pick of characters that she could add to her party, and she would have to stick to the shadows and evade the detection of security guards and stuff. Biting a symbiont would recharge her HP, but she would have to be careful not to bite the same symbiont too often. You know, the game writes itself. Someone needs to make this, I'm serious. The reason it would work so well as an RPG is that it is fundamentally a power fantasy. Shuri has her weaknesses and a conspiracy out to get her, but she effectively dominates from start to finish. I wish that the book were more aware that it is a domination fantasy. If it had that awareness, it wouldn't be so problematic that Shuri uses force to get her way with people she is supposed to respect. Similar to my issues with Dawn, Fledgling lacks an understanding of Shuri's unethical behavior, and in doing so effectively promotes coercion and rape. I enjoyed the read, and think that the power fantasy elevating this female character gives it at least some feminist content, but it does feminism a disservice by not recognizing male sexual vulnerability, and is in some ways no better than Twilight.